The bright lights of Hollywood's golden age turned ordinary people into gods and goddesses. Beautiful, immortal, untouchable. But time doesn't care about star power. In fact, sometimes fame accelerates the aging process in ways that shock even the most devoted fans. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 11 legendary stars whose final years were almost unrecognizable from their glory days. Some aged decades in just a few years. Others made desperate attempts to hold on to youth that backfired terribly. And one, number 7, underwent a transformation so shocking and heartbreaking that witnesses couldn't believe their eyes. These weren't just normal aging processes. These were cautionary tales written across once perfect faces. You've seen their classic films, admired their talent and beauty. But what happens when the cameras stop rolling and the unforgiving march of time takes over? What price did these icons pay for their years in the spotlight? And could their stories actually help us understand our own relationship with aging and mortality? Let's find out as we examine the shocking twilight years of Hollywood's brightest stars. From boy wonder to weathered veteran, Mickey Rooney's career began as America's favorite teenager. Those bright eyes, that boundless energy, that boyish charm, he was the perfect embodiment of youthful exuberance. Films like Boys Town and the Andy Hardy series made him Hollywood's top box office draw by the early 1940s, earning him $150,000 per film, astronomical money for the time. But beneath that cheerful exterior, Rooney lived hard and fast. While the public saw the clean-cut boy next door, Hollywood insiders witnessed his growing appetite for alcohol, gambling, and women. By his early 50s, when many stars were still in their prime, Mickey Rooney looked decades older than his actual age. His face, once so animated and youthful, had become bloated and sagging. The sparkle in his eyes had dulled, replaced by the weary gaze of someone who had seen too much too soon. 8 failed marriages certainly didn't help, nor did his addiction to gambling that left him bankrupt multiple times. The real culprit, however, was the unrelenting stress of maintaining stardom once his youthful appeal had faded. In a gut-wrenching television appearance during the 1970s, audiences gasped when Rooney walked on stage. The man who had once been America's teenager now looked like he could be his own grandfather. His skin hung loose, deeply creased with premature wrinkles, and his once athletic frame had grown soft and rounded. Ironically, Rooney would live to the age of 93, but spent more than half his life looking far older than his years, a teenage heartthrob turned grizzled grandpa in record time. Betty Hutton was one of the brightest lights of the 1940s, the blonde bombshell who vanished. Her performances in such classics as The Miracle of Morgan's Creek and Annie, Get Your Gun showed off her blend of comedy, singing, and dancing. Her face radiated wholesome all-American beauty, perfect features, million-dollar smile, and eyes that could light up with joy or break your heart in an instant. But the same intensity that made them a star brought them down. Behind the scenes, Betty battled fierce depression and an addiction to prescription pills. The pressure to maintain her perfect image pushed her over the edge. By the late 1950s, Betty's star had begun to fall, and with it, her legendary looks. A string of failed marriages, disappointing careers, and financial woes took a devastating toll on her physically and mentally. When she reemerged in the 1970s, even her most die-hard fans didn't recognize her. Years of breakdowns and botched cosmetic procedures had stretched and pulled her face into something unnatural. During a 1974 television interview, the camera caught Betty in hard light, her skin paper-thin and tightly pulled, and those once expressive eyes wide and strained from overdone surgery. The difference between this fragile woman and the vibrant performer 2 decades earlier was a heartbreaker. "I don't look in mirrors anymore," she said during one of her final interviews. "The person I see there isn't me." Betty Hutton didn't age. She disappeared behind a mask. Peter Lorre, the man who became his own shadow, never fit the Hollywood mold of handsome leading men. With his round face, bulging eyes, and unsettling presence, he carved out a niche playing sinister or tragic characters in films like M and Casablanca. In his youth, however, there was still something magnetic about his appearance, an intensity that demanded attention despite his small stature. But as the years passed, Lorre's distinctive features began to take on a disturbing quality. Chronic health problems, morphine addiction following a back injury, and heavy drinking aged him rapidly. By the 1960s, Lorre had become a ghost of himself. His once full face had collapsed inward, his cheeks hollowed, and his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His complexion turned gray and lifeless, giving him the appearance of a man perpetually ill. Those famous eyes, once haunting, now bulged unnaturally, as if he were trapped in a permanent state of shock. Makeup artists on his final film struggled to make him look healthier rather than more sinister. When Vincent Price viewed Lorre's body at his funeral in 1964, he reportedly said, "He looked so much better dead than alive." It wasn't cruel. It was an acknowledgement of how much suffering had been carved into Peter Lorre's face in his final years. Time did not take him softly. It dragged him down. Gloria Grahame was a beauty destroyed by her own hand. She had one of the most distinctive faces of 1950s film noir. Those pouty lips and that sultry gaze made her the ultimate femme fatale in classics, such as The Big Heat and In a Lonely Place. Her unique allure won her millions of fans, not to mention an Academy Award for the bad and the beautiful. But behind the glamour, Grahame fostered an insecurity that would ultimately destroy her looks. She was obsessed with the idea that her upper lip was too thin, a fixation that spiraled into one of Hollywood's most tragic beauty disasters. Starting in the mid-1950s, Grahame began a succession of operations to puff out her upper lip. But when more conventional means failed to give her the results she wanted, she took more radical action. If Hollywood legend is true, she began stuffing cotton or handkerchiefs under her upper lip before camera shoots to make it look fuller. Later, she began having fat sucked from other parts of her body and injected into it. The results were disastrous. By the 1960s, her once subtly full, naturally pouting lip had swollen into permanent misshapenness, distorting her entire face. The multiple procedures left her with visible scarring, asymmetry, and partial paralysis in her lip. Directors had to shoot her from particular angles or in shadow to mask the damage. When she was seen in person, the change was shocking, so much so, reportedly, that her ex-husband, director Nicholas Ray, didn't recognize her years later. The ultimate irony was that Grahame's original features, the ones she had tried so hard to change, are now celebrated by film historians as among the most captivating in cinema history. Her desperate attempts to fix what wasn't broken only destroyed the beauty that had made her unforgettable. Orson Welles, the genius who expanded in all directions, began his career with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Tall, handsome, and confident, with piercing eyes and a rich, commanding voice, he was the very image of a leading man. When he made Citizen Kane at just 25, Welles wasn't only a filmmaking prodigy, he was a strikingly attractive figure who exuded brilliance. But as time passed, his physical transformation became one of the most dramatic in Hollywood history. Welles's weight gain became the stuff of legend. The once trim director and actor ballooned to enormous proportions by the 1970s, more than doubling his youthful size. His chiseled jawline vanished beneath layers of flesh, his eyes grew hooded and puffy, and even his magnificent voice began to carry the strain of labored breathing. Welles was painfully aware of just how much he had changed. He took to joking about his size, once famously saying, "My doctor told me to stop having intimate dinners for 4, unless there are 3 other people." Behind that humor lay health problems and a career in decline. The heavy drinking, endless cigars, and years of stress took a visible toll. By his 60s, Welles moved like a man 20 years older, his skin pale and exhausted, his once commanding posture bent with fatigue. To conceal his weight, he wore flowing black capes and arranged to be filmed only from a chest up. He even grew a beard to hide his multiple chins and used makeup daily to give his complexion color. When he died in 1985 at age 70, many were surprised to learn his true age. Most people just assumed he was much older. In his final years, Orson Welles looked decades beyond his time, a larger-than-life genius who had expanded in every sense of the word. Bette Davis was known for her eyes, those great big expressive eyes that spoke volumes on raw emotion. They were her trademark, her weapon. her source of power. During her prime, Davis's eyes ruled the screen, and their fire and determination held audiences entranced. Her performances in films like All About Eve and Now, Voyager made her one of the most respected and fearless actresses of her generation. But the years were cruel to Bette Davis. Her fierce independence and relentless work ethic were equaled only by her vices, chief among them, her lifelong habit of chain smoking. Some said she went through as many as 4 packs a day, and it showed. Deep lines carved themselves into the flesh around her mouth and eyes, giving her a gaunt and almost haunted appearance. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Davis experienced a series of strokes that accelerated her decline. The first, in 1983, had partially paralyzed one side of her face, which also slurred her formerly precise way of speaking. When she appeared in public after that time, audiences were shocked. Her once full face was now skeletal, skin papery, and pulled taut over prominent bones. Her posture, once so appropriately upright and commanding, had curved into a painful stoop. Her hands quivered with a constant tremble of palsy. By the time she filmed The Whales of August in 1987, Davis seemed frail and ghost-like, the costumes hanging loosely on her shrunken frame. The director, Lindsay Anderson, remembered her having to struggle through performing simple movements, weakened as she was by illness and age. But her eyes, those legendary eyes, were still fierce and defiant. They shone out from her emaciated face, still sharp, still intelligent, still unmistakably Bette Davis. While the body could betray her, her gaze never did. Of course, the most heartbreaking of all had to be the story of Rita Hayworth, a sex symbol of a magnitude that few had ever seen or will ever witness. She wasn't just a star, she was Hollywood glamour personified in the 1940s. Her performance in Gilda made her an international icon, while her image as the ultimate screen siren was etched into history. Her beauty was of a legendary kind: impeccable skin, bright red hair, and that smile that combined innocence with seduction. During World War II, her pinup photo became one of the most reproduced images of the time. But no one could have imagined the tragic transformation awaiting her. By her 40s, Hayworth began to struggle with her memory and concentration. Once sharp and disciplined, she started to forget lines and miss cues on set. Directors assumed she was drunk. Even Hayworth believed her drinking was the cause of her problems. But it wasn't. In truth, she had early-onset Alzheimer's disease, though no one knew it at the time. As the years passed, her once graceful movements grew clumsy, her radiant expression dulled, and her famous beauty faded under the confusion and disorientation that came with the illness. By the early 1970s, she no longer recognized close friends or family. On film sets, she often looked lost, unable to understand what was happening around her. The most tragic moment came in 1976, when a production had to be shut down because Hayworth could no longer remember her lines or where she was. Witnesses described seeing her standing alone in her dressing room, confused and frightened, staring blankly at her reflection. It wasn't until 1980 that doctors correctly diagnosed her condition, making her one of the first public faces of Alzheimer's disease. By then, the damage was irreversible. In her last years, she appeared bloated, disheveled, and unrecognizable, her once famous hair limp and unkempt. The woman who had embodied glamour and sensuality now lived trapped in a fog, unaware of her fame, her films, or even her family. When she died in 1987, the world finally understood that her downfall had not been the result of vanity or vice, but of a devastating illness that stole her mind long before it claimed her life. Rita Hayworth's transformation was so extreme that some people believed it couldn't be real, but it was, and it changed the way the world viewed aging and memory forever. When Montgomery Clift arrived in Hollywood, his beauty was so perfect it seemed almost unreal. Chiseled features, soulful eyes, sensitive demeanor, he was a new kind of male beauty, less rugged than the stars who came before him, more vulnerable and complex. Along with Marlon Brando and James Dean, he helped redefine masculinity on screen, bringing emotional depth and psychological nuance to his roles. Then came the night that split his life and his face in two. On May 12, 1956, After leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift's car slammed into a telephone pole. The accident shattered his face, breaking his nose and jaw, fracturing his sinus, and leaving him with partial paralysis on the left side of his face. Extensive reconstructive surgery followed, but while the doctors did their best, the Montgomery Clift who emerged was visibly different from the one audiences had fallen in love with. The right side of his face remained handsome and expressive, but the left side was partially frozen, slightly sunken, asymmetrical. The flawless symmetry that had made him so striking was gone forever. The physical damage was only the beginning. To cope with the chronic pain, Clift became dependent on alcohol and prescription painkillers. The addiction accelerated his physical decline. Within just a few years, he looked decades older. By the early 1960s, only in his early 40s, Clift appeared gaunt and haggard. His skin had become loose and pale, his once athletic frame frail and thin. In his final film, The Defector, 1966, completed shortly before his death at age 45, Clift was all but unrecognizable from the beautiful young man who had starred in From Here to Eternity just 13 years earlier. His face was hollow, his eyes dark and weary, his voice weak and strained. Fellow actors described the experience of working with him as watching someone disappear before their eyes. According to director John Huston, it was like directing two completely different men, while Elizabeth Taylor, one of his closest friends, called his decline the longest disappearance in Hollywood history, a slow-motion self-destruction which the whole world was forced to watch. Janet Leigh screamed her way into cinema history in the shower scene from Hitchcock's Psycho, creating one of the most iconic moments in film. In her prime, she was fresh and naturally beautiful, a perfect cross between the girl next door and glamorous movie star. Her heart-shaped face, bright eyes, and genuinely engaging smile made her likable in an instant. However, as Leigh grew older, she eventually became one of the early adapters of cosmetic procedures at a time when those kinds of techniques were still considered experimental. Starting in the late 1970s, she received multiple facelifts and filler treatments, sometimes too close together, which resulted in gradual but noticeable changes. By the 1980s, there was simply no denying the overall difference. Her skin was tight and shiny, her eyes wide, and almost frozen in a permanent expression of surprise. Her smile moved strangely. Parts of her face would shift, while other parts stayed still. The natural expressiveness that had defined her on-screen presence was gone, replaced by a waxy smoothness that reflected studio light unnaturally. But it was more poignantly sad, because it seemed to somehow parallel her most famous role. Her wide eyes staring and her face frozen, she started to resemble Marion Crane in the moment of terror in that iconic shower. The contrast between the fresh-faced young woman on screen and the older, surgically altered star was jarring in her later public appearances, including a 50th anniversary screening of Psycho in 2010. Elegant and dignified she was, but the facial movements were limited, as though time and surgery had frozen her somewhere between youth and fear. Edward G. Robinson made a career out of playing gangsters and tough guys, with Little Caesar cementing his status as cinema's archetypal mob boss. Though short and not conventionally handsome, Robinson's face was his fortune. His heavy-lidded eyes, strong nose, and determined jaw gave him authority and intensity. But age and hardship were unkind. A lifelong smoker, Robinson's skin became leathery and deeply creased by his late 50s. Chronic heart problems required medication that caused fluid retention, giving his face a swollen, puffy look. By the 1960s, his transformation was striking. His once sharp features had softened into sagging jowls and baggy eyes, and his complexion grew pale and uneven. Emotional stress only worsened the decline. During the McCarthy era, Robinson was blacklisted and forced to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Though eventually cleared, the ordeal aged him dramatically in a short time. By his final movie, Soylent Green in 1973, the man who once strode imposingly across the screen was hunched and spent. Makeup artists struggled to give him some semblance of former vigor, but only succeeded in accentuating his weakness. Director Richard Brooks, who had worked with the great star in his heyday, spoke the sentiment of many. The face that launched 1,000 gangsters has run aground. The tough guy who had once terrorized audiences now looked heartbreakingly fragile, a reminder that even Hollywood's hardest men could not outrun the ages. Mae West, on the other hand, did the opposite. The iconic sex symbol of the 1930s refused to age at all, or at least, refused to acknowledge that she had. With her curves, platinum hair, and flirtatious wit, West clung to the same image well into her 70s and 80s. She continued to dye her hair the same brilliant blonde, slather on layers of makeup, and dress in the same kind of provocative style she had made famous decades earlier. But by the time she appeared in Myra Breckinridge, 1970, at age 77, and Sextet, 1978, at 85, the effect was unsettling. Her wig sat stiffly, her makeup was applied in thick layers, and her once fluid walk had become a slow, cautious shuffle. Her refusal to adapt to age made her performances seem surreal. In Sextet, she played a sex goddess desired by much younger men, delivering her signature lines through an earpiece because her eyesight had failed. Under bright lights, the makeup cracked and caked, turning her face into a mask. Critics were merciless. One called her final performance like watching your grandmother perform a striptease. Yet West remained defiant, insisting she still felt as young and desirable as ever. "I never worried about age," she said. "I'll always be a young woman who has aged." But the camera told another story.